There are moments in life when the world decides you don't belong anymore. When the people who raised you, who knew your name since childhood, suddenly look through you as if you've become invisible. Worse than invisible, as if you've become something dangerous, something that needs to be removed. That's what happened to Sadi Pike on a cold autumn morning in 1887 when she was cast out from the only home she'd ever known, sent into the wilderness with nothing but an axe, a mule, and the weight of a false accusation that no amount of truth-telling could undo. But here's where the story takes a turn that no one could have predicted. In the very place designed to be her tomb, Sadi would discover something that would not only save her life but would transform an entire region and expose the hypocrisy of those who condemned her. What she found in that desolate canyon would challenge everything we think we know about punishment, redemption, and the true measure of a person's worth. Bitter Creek wasn't much of a town. It was more of an idea than a place. A rigid community built on rules so strict they seemed designed to crush the human spirit rather than nurture it. The settlement existed in the shadow of preacher Theron Blackwood, a man whose faith had calcified into something cold and punitive. He didn't preach about God's love. He preached about God's judgment, God's wrath, God's endless disappointment in the fallen nature of mankind. And he wielded that theology like a weapon against anyone who dared to think differently or act independently. Sadi Pike had grown up in this suffocating environment. She was 19 years old, intelligent, capable, and quietly beautiful in a way that made the preacher deeply uncomfortable. She had a habit of thinking for herself, of asking questions when things didn't make sense, and worst of all, she had compassion. She couldn't ignore suffering when she saw it, even when ignoring it was exactly what the community's rigid hierarchy demanded. The incident that destroyed her life was almost trivial in its origins. Martha Prim, a 10-year-old girl, was accused of stealing an apple from the community stores. The girl was terrified, denying the accusation through tears, but her pleas meant nothing. The preacher had already decided on her guilt, and his word was law in Bitter Creek. What the preacher didn't know, what only Sadi had seen, was that it was actually Ezekiel Blackwood, the preacher's own son, who had taken the apple. Sadi had watched it happen. She'd seen the boy slip the fruit beneath his coat while everyone else was occupied with work. When Sadi spoke up, when she simply and quietly told the truth, she thought she was being helpful. She thought that in a community built on faith and morality, the truth would matter. She was catastrophically wrong. Questioning the preacher's judgment was the same as questioning God himself in Bitter Creek. And worse, questioning his son was an act of rebellion that could not be tolerated. The preacher's response was swift and vicious. He took the accusation of theft and rebuilt it entirely. He declared that Sadi was a vessel of pride, a seed of rebellion planted in their righteous soil. He said she had deliberately accused an innocent boy out of malice and spiritual corruption. The community, trained to obey without question, accepted his narrative without hesitation. Within a single afternoon, Sadi's entire life was dismantled. 19 years of being helpful, of working hard, of contributing to the community meant nothing. 19 years of singing hymns in a clear, true voice, of mending fences, of helping with the harvest, of being a dutiful member of their society, all of it was erased as if it had never mattered at all. She was declared an outcast, a girl to be feared, a girl to be forgotten. And on the appointed day of her exile, they sent her to Whisper Wind Canyon, to a place known only as the Exile's Cave, a dark mouth in the mountainside where the community sent people to die and be forgotten. Sadi didn't cry as she walked away from Bitter Creek. She had made a decision that if she was going to leave, she would leave with her dignity intact. She would not give Preacher Blackwood the satisfaction of seeing her tears. So she walked, one foot in front of the other, with her jaw clenched and her eyes fixed forward. The dust from the single road of Bitter Creek clung to her wool skirt, and she didn't brush it away. That dust was the last tangible connection to everything she had known, and she almost welcomed it as a final insult, something she could eventually shake off. Leading her was a gray mule named Jude, who had been given to her by Silas Croft, the blacksmith's boy. Silas had met her at the edge of the settlement lands, his face a mask of helpless anger. He couldn't speak openly against the preacher without condemning himself, but he could do something. He pressed the lead rope into her hand, and along with it, a heavy well-oiled felling axe and a small sack of hardtack and salt pork. His words were few but meaningful. He told her that Jude was stubborn but strong. "Like you, Sadi," he'd said, his eyes fixed on the ground because he didn't have the courage to meet her gaze. Those words were the only kindness she had heard in a week, and they struck her like a hot coal in her chest, burning with a warmth that was both comforting and painful. The journey to the canyon took 2 days of walking through increasingly harsh terrain. As she traveled westward, the landscape changed around her. The ordered fields of Bitter Creek gave way to rougher country, marked by rocky outcroppings and scrubland. The settlements and farms became fewer and farther between until finally, there was nothing but wilderness. The sky seemed to grow bigger with each mile, the horizon more distant, and Sadi found herself feeling smaller and smaller as the landscape swallowed her up. On the afternoon of the second day she encountered one more person. Era was an old woman who kept to herself, a midwife and herbalist whom the community tolerated for her skills but distrusted for her obvious independence. She was waiting by her fence line as if she'd been expecting Sadi all along, which was impossible and yet somehow felt inevitable. Era's face was a roadmap of wrinkles, her eyes dark and knowing. She didn't offer sympathy or pity or any of the platitudes Sadi might have expected. Instead, she simply held out a gnarled hand and pressed a small, smooth, dark stone into Sadi's palm. "They see a tomb," Era said, her voice dry as autumn leaves. "But the stone remembers the fire. Listen for its warmth." The words made no sense to Sadi, but she thanked the old woman and continued on her way. As she walked, she turned the stone over and over in her fingers, trying to understand what it meant, unable to make sense of it. It felt inert and lifeless, nothing but a smooth rock. But she tucked it into her pocket anyway because it was the last gift she would receive for a very long time. As the sun began its descent that afternoon, painting the sky in brutal strokes of orange and purple, Sadi saw the cave for the first time. It was a dark, gaping shadow on a distant hillside, larger and more ominous than she had imagined. It didn't look like a shelter. It looked like a wound in the earth, a place where something had been torn away, leaving behind only absence. Jude stopped walking, his ears twitching, and let out a low, mournful bray that seemed to echo the very desolation of the place. Even the animal understood that this was not a destination but an ending point. The entrance to the cave was vast, a jagged mouth of gray limestone fringed with skeletal, wind-stunted junipers. Cold, damp air flowed from its depths, carrying the scent of wet stone and ancient stillness. It smelled like a place where things went to die. Sadi stood before it as darkness crept across the canyon, and she felt something break inside her. This was her inheritance now. Not a parcel of land. Not a family name. Not a future. Just a hollowed-out piece of nothing, a place that felt like the earth's own tomb. Her punishment was not just exile from the community, but relegation to this place, a location so desolate and forsaken that it seemed designed specifically to strip away her will to survive. She didn't venture deep into the cave that first night. The darkness was too absolute, too complete. Instead, she found a relatively sheltered spot just inside the entrance, a shallow alcove where the rock curved away from the prevailing wind. She tethered Jude nearby, and his warm, solid presence became a small comfort against the encroaching dark. She built no fire. The wood was damp, and she didn't want to draw unwanted attention from whatever might be lurking in the wilderness. She simply huddled into herself, pulling her thin shawl tighter, and ate a piece of dry hardtack that tasted like chalk and despair. The memory of Silas kept returning to her mind. The way he couldn't meet her gaze, the shame and fury warring in his expression, the care with which he'd given her the axe. It was a good axe, balanced and heavy, a tool for building and creating. He had given her a tool for a future, even as everyone else had sentenced her to a dead end. The irony was bitter. What was there to build here? What could be cleared away except her own foolish hope? The first week in the canyon was a blur of pure survival. Sadi's waking thoughts were consumed entirely by the immediate and the essential: water, food, and some form of shelter. The hardtack and salt pork that Silas had given her would not last forever, and she had to find a sustainable way to live, or she would simply starve to death in this forsaken place, which was probably exactly what the people of Bitter Creek expected would happen. Her first breakthrough came when she began to explore the cave more deeply. Armed with a torch made from a resinous pine branch, she ventured past the entrance and into the darkness. The cave was not a single chamber but a network of them, branching off from the main opening like the hallways of a strange subterranean house. As she moved deeper, something unexpected happened. The air grew warmer and the temperature rose as she traveled further into the earth. In one of the smaller chambers, far from the entrance, she found what she had been desperately searching for. A steady, patient drip of water seeping from a fissure in the ceiling, collecting in a shallow basin-like depression in the stone floor. The water was icy cold and tasted of minerals, but it was clean and constant. As she drank from it, cupping her hands to catch the precious drops, Sadi felt something shift inside her. She would not die of thirst. This small discovery felt monumental. It was the first sign that this place might not be actively trying to kill her. It was merely indifferent, and in that indifference there was a sliver of room to live. Over the following weeks, Sadi began to adapt to her new reality. She learned which plants were edible and which were poisonous. She discovered which areas of the canyon held the most game, where rabbits made their runs, and how to set simple snares to catch them. She learned the landscape with an intimacy born entirely of necessity. She noticed the way a particular hawk circled the same thermal every afternoon. She noticed the faint trail of a fox leading to its den among the rocks. She became attuned to the subtle life of the canyon in a way she never could have been in the orderly, insular world of Bitter Creek. And she noticed something about the cave itself, something that seemed almost impossible to explain. The back wall of the main chamber, the section she had been planning to use as a shield against the winter wind, was not uniform like the rest of the cave. Most of the cave was rough gray limestone, but this particular wall was different. A large section of it was a darker, smoother stone, almost seamless, and it seemed to hold the day's warmth long after the sun had set. On frosty mornings, when the air was sharp and crystalline, she would sometimes see a faint vapor rising from its surface, as if the stone itself were breathing. Era's cryptic words came back to her with sudden urgency. The stone remembers the fire. She began to pay closer attention to this strange wall. She would press her palm against it at different times of day. In the morning it was cool to the touch, but by late afternoon, it radiated a gentle, persistent heat, as if there were a slow-burning fire deep within the mountain itself. The other walls were always cold and damp, but this one section, a space perhaps 10 feet wide and just as high, was alive with this strange, subtle warmth. It was a mystery that hummed in the back of her mind. As autumn began its inexorable slide toward winter, a new urgency took hold of Sadi. The cave offered shelter from the wind and rain, but the cold was a more insidious enemy. She needed walls. She needed a door. She needed something more than just a hollow in the rock if she was going to survive the coming months. The idea came to her one morning as she watched the sun strike the eastern face of the canyon. She would not live in the cave. She would build onto it. She would construct a small, sturdy cabin directly against the entrance, using the cave itself as the back wall and its natural ventilation as a perfect chimney for a hearth. It was an audacious plan for a 19-year-old girl with a single axe and a mule. But once the idea took root in her mind, it refused to be dislodged. She began immediately. Using the axe that Silas had given her, she started felling the lodgepole pines that grew in a thick stand on the north side of the valley. The work was brutal and relentless. Each swing of the axe sent a jarring shock up her arms. Her hands, already calloused from weeks of labor, blistered and bled, then healed into thicker, tougher skin. She learned to read the grain of the wood to make the precise angled cuts that would bring a tree down exactly where she wanted it. Jude became her essential partner in this work. She would loop ropes around the felled logs, and the patient mule would lean into his harness, dragging them one by one across the valley floor and up the gentle slope to the cave. Days bled into weeks. The pile of logs grew steadily, and as she worked, something remarkable happened. Sadi stopped being afraid. She stopped thinking about the injustice of her exile or the cruelty of Bitter Creek. Instead, she was present in her labor. She was focused on the immediate work of building something, of creating a life with her own two hands. The cabin rose slowly, log by painstaking log. Sadi was not a carpenter by training, but she was a patient and observant learner. She had watched the men of Bitter Creek raise barns and houses, and she remembered the way they notched the logs to fit snugly together, the way they chinked the gaps with mud and moss to keep the wind out. Her work was rougher and less precise than theirs, but it was solid. It was built with intention and care. She worked from dawn until her muscles screamed and the light failed, driven by the cold wind that carried the first hints of snow. It was during the construction of this cabin that she made her most puzzling discovery. The back wall of the main chamber, the wall that was supposed to become the back of her hearth, continued to perplex her. One afternoon, while she was measuring the space for where the hearthstones would go, she ran her hand over its smooth, dark surface. The fine, almost invisible cracks she had noticed before seemed to form a pattern. It wasn't random. It looked deliberate, like a spiderweb or the delicate veining of a leaf. It didn't look like the random, chaotic cracking of natural stone that had been exposed to thousands of years of weather and temperature changes. Her plan required her to chip away some of the rock to create a flat base for the hearthstones she had collected from the creek bed. She took up the pickaxe, the smaller, sharper tool that she had found along with ancient flint points in the back of the cave. She hesitated for a moment, feeling a strange reluctance to scar the unusual stone. But the need for a fire, for a defense against the coming winter, was greater than her curiosity or her hesitation. She swung the pickaxe. It struck the wall with a dull thud, unlike the sharp crack she expected when striking limestone. A dinner plate-sized chunk of dark outer rock flaked away and fell to the floor. Sadi knelt, her heart suddenly beating faster. Beneath the dull, dark exterior was not more of the same. It was something else entirely. A milky white stone webbed with faint gray lines gleamed in the dim light of the cave entrance. It was quartz, not limestone. A massive, solid wall of quartz hidden just beneath a thin, brittle crust. She stared, her mind struggling to understand what she was seeing. Why would a vein of quartz this large be hidden beneath this outer layer? How had this thin crust of dark mineral formed? She reached out a trembling hand and touched the exposed surface. It was cool now, but she could still feel that faint resonant warmth emanating from deep within. She took the pickaxe again, this time with more care and deliberation, and chipped away another piece of the dark crust. More of the beautiful white stone was revealed, and then she saw it. A thin, brilliant yellow line, no thicker than a thread, running through the heart of the quartz. It wasn't a trick of the light. She scraped at it with her fingernail and it came away soft and metallic. Gold. Pure gold, threaded through the stone like veins of precious light. The pickaxe fell from her numb fingers and clattered on the stone floor. Sadi scrambled closer, her breath catching in her throat. She used the smaller point of the tool to carefully flake away more of the dark outer shell. The single thread of gold became a network. It branched and spread, weaving through the milky quartz in a pattern that was breathtaking and impossible. It was as if someone had poured molten sunlight directly into the heart of the mountain. The entire wall, that 10 by 10 foot section that had puzzled her with its strange warmth and its patterned cracks, was a solid mass of gold-bearing quartz. She sat back on her heels, the enormity of it washing over her. The judgment, the laughter, the exile, it all seemed to shrink and become small and distant. Preacher Blackwood had banished her to a congregation of stone, mocking her with the promise of a cold and empty future. He had sent her to the most worthless, desolate place he could imagine. And in doing so, he had inadvertently led her to a fortune beyond his wildest, most covetous dreams. Era's words echoed in her mind with new meaning. The stone remembers the fire. This stone, this gold, was born of the earth's fire, a secret it had held for an eternity. Sadi began to laugh, a sound that started as a choked sob and grew into a full-throated, joyous peal that echoed through the empty chambers of the cave. The rocks were her congregation indeed, and they had just delivered a sermon of glorious golden vindication. Winter arrived not as a gentle dusting of snow, but as a furious roaring blizzard. The sky turned a bruised slate gray, and the wind howled like a hungry wolf, driving sheets of blinding snow before it. In a matter of hours the entire landscape was transformed, its familiar contours buried beneath a deep white blanket. But inside her small, sturdy cabin, Sadi was safe. The structure, built with aching muscles and stubborn determination, held firm against the gale. The mud and moss chinking kept the wind at bay, and the heavy plank door fashioned from the thickest part of a pine trunk was barred shut. Her hearth, built against the magnificent wall of quartz and gold, drew beautifully, its flames casting a warm, dancing light across the room. The stone itself seemed to amplify the heat, radiating a steady, comforting warmth that filled the small space. The golden veins in the quartz caught the firelight, glittering like a captured constellation. It was a sight so beautiful it made her heart ache. She had food stored, wood stacked high, and fresh water from the spring inside the cave. She was prepared. She had built more than a shelter. She had built a sanctuary. On the second day of the blizzard, as the storm reached its peak, she heard a sound that did not belong. A frantic, muffled banging on her door, nearly lost in the shrieking of the wind. Her first instinct was fear. Who could possibly be out in this? Without thinking, driven by something deeper than reason, she lifted the heavy wooden bar and pulled the door inward. A blast of snow and wind tore into the cabin, and a man, completely covered in ice and snow, stumbled inside and collapsed onto the floor. Two more figures followed. A woman holding a small bundled child, both of them sobbing with cold and exhaustion. The man on the floor pushed himself up, his face gaunt, his beard caked with ice. "Our wagon," he croaked, his voice raw. "Broken axle. Been walking for hours. Our boy, he's sick." Sadi shut the door, sealing them once more inside the warm, quiet space. She helped the man to his feet and guided the woman and child closer to the fire. The child, a boy of about 5, was pale and still, his breathing shallow, his face hot to the touch. "Fever." The man introduced himself as Thomas Miller, a carpenter. His wife was Elizabeth and their son was Daniel. Thomas looked from the gold gleaming in the firelight to Sadi's face, a mixture of awe and disbelief in his expression. But Sadi's attention was on the boy. She fetched a clean cloth and dipped it in cool water from the spring, gently placing it on his forehead. She remembered the remedies that Era had taught her, the herbs for fever and coughs. She had a small store of dried willow bark, a gift from the old woman. She brewed it into a bitter tea, coaxing the boy to drink a little. She wrapped him in her own warmest blankets and sat with him through the night, murmuring softly, keeping vigil over his small, fevered form. The millers watched her with a mixture of exhaustion and astonishment. They had stumbled through a frozen hell, certain they were going to die, only to be rescued by a young woman living alone in a cabin built into a cave of gold. For 2 days and nights, the blizzard raged on, and Sadi tended to the Miller family without hesitation. She shared her food, her warmth, and her knowledge. She sat with young Daniel, changing the cool cloths on his forehead, spooning broth and willow bark tea between his cracked lips. She treated this family with a kindness and generosity that came from somewhere deep within her. On the third morning the wind finally died down and the snow stopped. Daniel's fever had broken. He was weak, but his eyes were clear and he was able to take a little food. Elizabeth wept with relief, clutching Sadi's hand. When the Millers were strong enough to travel, Thomas helped Sadi dig a path through the snow. He promised to send for his wagon and to repay her kindness. Before they left, he pressed a small hand-carved wooden bird into her palm. "For Daniel," he said with deep emotion. "He'll never forget you. Neither will we." The story of the girl in the cave cabin spread through the town of Dalton like a wildfire in a dry season. Thomas Miller, a man known for his honesty and plain-spoken manner, told anyone who would listen about their miraculous rescue. He spoke of the blizzard, his son's fever, and the young woman who had taken them in without question, nursing the boy back to health with kindness and herbal remedies. And he spoke in a hushed and reverent voice of the cabin's back wall. "It wasn't just stone," he would say, his eyes still wide with the memory. "It was like the heart of the mountain was laid bare, white rock shot through with pure gold, glowing in the firelight." Most dismissed it as a fever dream, the tall tale of a man who had stared death in the face. But the story reached the ears of a man who did not dismiss it. Alastair Davies was a geologist and circuit assayer from the territorial capital, a quiet scholarly man with gentle eyes and hands stained by chemicals and rock dust. His profession was to separate fact from fiction. Intrigued by the earnestness of Miller's account, Davies bought provisions, and rode out in search of Whisper Wind Canyon. He found Sadi chopping wood, the rhythmic thud of her axe the only sound in the crisp morning air. She was wary at first, her hand never straying far from the axe handle as he approached. But Davies dismounted and introduced himself with a calm and respectful demeanor that put her at ease. He explained that he had heard Mr. Miller's story, and as a student of the Earth's secrets, he hoped she would permit him to see the remarkable stone formation. Seeing no harm in the quiet man, Sadi led him inside. Davies stood before the hearth for a long time, silent and reverent. He took a small magnifying glass from his waistcoat pocket and examined the wall with meticulous care, tracing the veins of gold with a careful finger. He tapped it gently with a small rock hammer, listening to the resonant pitch. Finally he turned to Sadi, his expression one of profound scholarly awe. "Young woman," he said, his voice soft, "do you have any idea what this is?" He explained that it was a lode deposit of extraordinary rarity and richness. The warmth she had felt was likely a subtle geothermal signature, and the gold was of the highest purity. "This isn't a strike, Miss Pike," he said, his voice filled with quiet excitement. "This is a treasury. This is a king's ransom." He helped her understand what she needed to do. He explained the process of filing a claim, not in nearby Bitter Creek, but at the land office in Dalton, where the law was administered fairly. He drew up the claim papers himself, mapping the boundaries with precision, ensuring her rights were protected. He treated her not as an ignorant girl, but as the rightful steward of a geological marvel. With his quiet, professional confirmation, Sadi's world shifted on its axis. The news, now certified by an expert, electrified Dalton. Prospectors and merchants began to make the journey to Whisper Wind Canyon, not as a rush of greedy men, but as a slow, respectful stream of people drawn by the legend of the cave angel and her mountain of gold. They did not come to take but to trade. They brought lumber, tools, flour, sugar, and fabrics, offering them in exchange for a chance to pan the creek that ran from Sadi's mountain, a creek she allowed them to work for a small share. A community began to sprout in the valley below her cabin. A collection of tents and small rough-hewn shacks that would soon be known as Pike's Hollow. It was a town founded not on a lawless rush, but on the quiet dignity and generosity of its matriarch. Within a year, Pike's Hollow had grown into a thriving settlement with a general store, a livery stable, and real homes where families were building lives. Inevitably, the news traveled the 20 miles back to Bitter Creek. It arrived as a rumor, then as a confirmed fact that struck the settlement like a bolt of lightning. Preacher Blackwood, when he heard it, reportedly went pale and locked himself in the meeting house for a full day. The congregation that had cast Sadi out now muttered amongst themselves, their piety curdling into a mixture of disbelief and envy. She had found her company with the unfeeling stone, just as he had commanded, and the stone had rewarded her with riches beyond their collective imagination. His curse had become the ultimate blessing, and his judgment was exposed for what it was, the hollow posturing of a small, cruel man. One warm summer evening, Sadi stood in the doorway of her cabin, which was no longer a simple shelter but a solid, well-built home, expanded and improved with the help of Thomas Miller and other grateful carpenters. Below the settlement of Pike's Hollow was a warm, bustling community. The sounds of laughter, of a blacksmith's hammer, of children playing, drifted up the slope. It was a town built on a foundation of respect, a place where your worth was measured by the work of your hands and the kindness in your heart. Jude the mule stood beside her, his head resting on her shoulder, his soft breath warm against her neck. He was old now, his working days behind him, content to spend his time in the sun and her company. The mocking jeers and cold shoulders of Bitter Creek felt like a story from another person's life. She rarely thought of them anymore. Thomas Miller, now the mayor of the small but growing town, walked up the path to her cabin, carrying a newly finished rocking chair, its wood smooth and gleaming. "A gift," he said with a smile, "from all of us for the town's founder." He set it on her porch, a place that now overlooked a thriving community. He gestured to the town below, the neat cabins, the general store, the livery stable. "It's amazing what you've built here, Sadi," he said, his voice full of sincere admiration. "What do you call this place? Your home? I mean, does it have a name?" Sadi looked from the warm light spilling from her doorway to the valley filled with families she had given a chance. She looked at the dark, familiar opening of the cave, now a seamless part of her home, its entrance no longer a forbidding mouth, but a welcoming threshold. She thought of the preacher's curse, the intended finality of her exile, and the simple, profound truth she had discovered. "They called it an exile," she said, her voice quiet but clear, carrying the weight of all she had endured and overcome. "I just learned it was a foundation."